Let's start that again. United are still losing money, but still one of the biggest clubs in the world with nearly 700 million of revenue coming in, and this football club still cannot escape from the financials. Look, we are £752 million in debt, 29 million paid in interest in just 9 months, over £500 million in squad cost running through this club. And honestly, this morning's accounts explain exactly why United suddenly feel weird in the transfer market. Why every deal feels like it's slow, why every negotiation feels cautious, why every briefing suddenly sounds like value, structure, wage control, young profile of players, PSR, SCR, squad cap rules, and this is why. Here is the really frightening part of this. United might be on the edge of UEFA squad cap rules, and look, I will go into why. Look, meaning this summer United may have to sell before they can properly rebuild. Look, this changes everything. Now look, do me a favour right now. Are United actually broke? Yes or no? So I want to know in this chat whether United are broke. Now, I have seen a chat already, and I'm not going to call it out, saying, look, we think we're going to be okay. So, look, because this is where it gets mad. Look, City do spend without blinking. Arsenal are building, and Madrid, look, they always build, and they're going to look to rebuild their midfield. And United, look, we're sitting here discussing this morning whether we can afford amortization structures and flexibility in the wage. Look, this football club, and we're talking about the Q3 results today, have become a financial balancing act. United are not poor, and as you can see on screen, look, the graphic is there, and we will go through the positives already because there are some positives in this financial statement. Look, what cannot be denied is at the moment we are financially impacted, and there's a massive difference here between the revenue is elite, the fan base is elite, the commercial power is elite. But the structure of this football club financially is still a mess after years of the Glazer ownership. And look, this is where most fans don't understand what is happening to the club. Now, look, you guys are intelligent. I'm not trying to say for a second that you guys don't understand this. Some people don't. And why should you understand it? You should care. All you should care about is the transfers. All you should care about is the good stuff. Look, everybody keeps screaming PSR, 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 but honestly, PSR might not even be the real issue anymore. UEFA squad cap ratio might be the biggest problem. Now look, under UEFA squad cap rules, you can only spend 70% of the revenue, amortization and agents' fees. United estimate annual squad cost at the moment of over £500 million. That's over £500 million. And this is why United suddenly care about every contract. This is why we're not just going after Tonali. This is why Anderson, we're not just going to go after him. This is why mainly seems out of reach, because look, we've got to get the amortization, we've got to get the wages down. This is what we've got to do. And look, let me ask you this, do you trust the football department to rebuild? Do you trust United dealing with debt, SCR restrictions, transfer liabilities and huge wages already in the squad? Now look, this changes the summer completely, because suddenly Casemiro is leaving, that matters, Rashford is leaving, Sancho is leaving, Anthony is leaving. And financially, look, this will explain every player sold, the wages, amortization, does create room, flexibility, creates UEFA headroom. And look, this is why sales are critical. Look, the sales overall, we focus on the profit. Look, we're probably going to break even on some of our sales. But look, this is why Rashford is going to be sold. This is why, some of these players, like Onana, if we can get him off of the books, this is why, look, we need to sell, these players. This is why the Greenwood extra money for him comes in. So look, this is why at the moment we're suddenly getting linked to younger players, lower wages. Edison is the prime example. And look, chat, I promise you I will get into that. And this is why we're looking for value opportunities. Edison is prime example of that. The players with resale. And this is why Edison makes financial sense. This is why United are hesitating on the superstar deals. This is why we need to go to Italy. We've got to try to get these deals down. Look, we can't just pay 80 million on transfers because look, United carry total debt, and we are going to get into the debt as well. So look, what we are talking about at the moment is this, and let me go through some of these figures as well, because look, it is important to look at this. So look, at the moment we are 752, as I said, in debt. Look, it is absolutely ridiculous that look, this club at the moment, and we've posted a loss of 14.2 million pounds on revenue of 665. But look, the revenue is up 18%, which is great. EBITDA is up by 29%. Look, the operational profit, and as we talk about on here, there's a difference between operation profit and net. It's gone from a 3.2 million loss to a 37 million profit. Now look, United are going to focus on that, but there is another side to that. Broadcasting income is up by 57%, and commercial revenue is elite. Look, we have got operationally, we are better. Champions League qualification, retail is booming. Look, people are buying shirts. People are buying the shirts. Cost cutting does work. Operationally, United are still one of the biggest money making machines in the world. The broadcasting in this Q3 has gone up from 134 to 157. Now, why is this? This is because better Champions League finish, Champions League qualification, higher TV distribution. Look, we've gone from 15th to 3rd. That's 12 places. Look, that is 36 million pounds extra. And this is why getting back into the Champions League is so important. Now, look, INEOS will point to this. Look, employee benefit expenses, the redundancies, look, they're down from 46.6 to 42%, meaning the cost is showing up. Look, you've got redundancies, tighter spending, operational cuts. Look, the Glazers sound like Labour, and the Glazers sound like they are cutting costs. And look, it is showing in the numbers. So operationally, we are elite. But look, there is still a massive problem. Look, PSR is not the biggest issue anymore. UEFA Squad Cap might be the problem. And this is where effectively limited clubs are spending by 70% on wages, amortization and agents' fees. Look, our projected income is around £660 million. And look, our squad cap limit is around 662. So when we're talking about the revenue, 660 is projected. That means that we can spend. This means our squad cap headroom is 462. Now here is the bombshell. Estimated wages are around 293. Amortization is around 215. So combined before agents fees, we're carrying £508 million, which is over the £462 million. Look, we will not be penalised this year, but in different years we will be penalised. So this is why we and that is absolutely insane. We are over squad cap rules. Now look, we are not poor by any stretch of the imagination. We are financially impacted, and this is now where we are financially impacted by the debt. As I've said before, the revenue is elite, the fan base is elite, their commercial power is elite, but the financial structure in this club is not great. This summer will completely change. Look, we need Casemiro to leave, we need Rashford to leave and get the profit. We need Sancho to leave. Sancho is going to leave. Anthony, obviously he's gone as well. And look, every player sold does remove wages. That 504 will come down. Xerxes, when he moves, hopefully he will move. That comes down as well. The Maguire's wages coming down will help, and this creates the headroom. Now look, there is a difference between revenue and profit made. As I said before, we're probably now with Greenwood probably going to make around profit wise around £40 million, and look, that is huge. So look, sales are critical to this. Now look, we are going to be talking about the nightmare of debt, and look, this is the real killer. This is where we are impacted. Now look, long term, the borrowings are £490 million, and these are long term. The current of the borrowings are 262. Combined, that is 752. United still have one of the biggest debt burdens in world football of any club. Thank you, Sky, for the super chat. Tuck yourself in and for some sun cream. Look, Sky is an absolute legend. Thank you so much. So look, the other thing to consider when we are talking about EBITDA, we're talking about the profit. So look, we made operationally £33 million, and this should make every United fan angry at this point. Interest paid so far is 29.2 in 9 months. That factually is money out of the door. That is not paid over 5 years. That is £40 million in interest payment alone on the Glazers' debt. Annually £40 million. Look, that is disappearing in debt interest. So look, when we are talking about what impacts, we are losing £40 million out of the door. That £40 million for amortization and squad cap rules is absolutely ridiculous. Imagine if that £40 million is the equivalent of £100 million player every year. We would save £40 million every single year. That is £100 million player, the £100 million player that we need. If we had that 40 million, we could just go and get Tonali like that. We could go and get Anderson. We would be able to do so much. Now look, imagine if that money went into transfers, recruitment, infrastructure, the stadium, the football department. And look, this is the real legacy. This is the real cost of the ownership of the Glazers. Now look, here is another problem that nobody is going to talk about here. The trade payables. Now this is money that we've got to pay. This is the payables of, this is a balance sheet. This is the debt. £310 million of transfer instalments, creditors, people that we owe money to, and structure. This is why we've got to pay £238 million out in cash. This is in cash that we have to pay out. And then look, this is why we are being financially squeezed. Look, we've got £238 million that we've got to pay. On top of that, that's £40 million that we've got to pay. That's £278 million that we have to pay this window. This is not over 5 years. This is cash we've got to pay out now. And this is why we do feel financially squeezed. Look, our cash position is 60.9. Now look, this cash reserve seems like 60.9, and you think, look, this is fantastic. It really isn't. On £660 million, our cash reserve should be higher, and where the cash reserves matters is on transfers this season. Look, we will be paying the first instalment on these players. We'll probably need the first instalments this year to be 100 in cash that needs to be paid. We've only got 60.9. Look, this is not huge cash. People will talk to you about huge cash. It is not huge cash. It is absolutely catastrophic. Now look, because of the debt, and this is what people forget as well, is the FX exchange rate. Now this is tangible, and this gets even worse. The FX rate, this is the price between the dollar amount and the pound amount. And don't forget the interest rate in America. This is American debt, and this is higher. By purely having the debt, it's cost us £10 million. So the money going out at the end of the year in cash, or the fluctuations mean, and I'm going to correct myself there. £10 million will not be paid out in cash. That will reduce the debt figure. So the debt with the 40 million and 10 million, just by having the debt remaining, is £50 million of debt. So when we are talking about profit, the £33 million from operationally, from the revenue that we make from the shirt sales, from the sponsors, from league position, from Champions League, is getting absolutely wiped out and destroyed by the debt. And look, there are fluctuations in this debt, and this is why United will look to restructure this debt. Now, what are the consequences for the summer window? This is why the summer window completely changes, and we are talking about the Q3 results here. Under UEFA Squad Cap, wages matter, amortization matters, transfer matters, agent fee matters. Now look, people will scream, just spend £100 million. Let's get Tonali for 86. Let's get Anderson for 100. But the reality is, look, 100 million signing, as we've spoken about, on a 5-year deal is £20 million amortized. Then you've got to add in the wages, the agents' fees, possibly a signing on fee, and that one player costs you £40 million a year under UEFA Squad Cap. This is why United are looking at an Edison. This is why we want younger players. This is why we want to pay the lower wages. I'm not against the lower wages. This is why we've got to structure the deal. Players with resale value. This is why we are doing that. So look, this is why it all comes to light. This is why Edison, younger profile of players, value, opportunity suddenly make more sense financially. And then because the issue is no longer can United afford the transfer fee, the issue now is can United carry the total annual squad cost. Now, here is the really frightening part of this. Even with Champions League, even with the revenue of £660 million this year, even with operational improvement, even with massive cost cutting, United this season they're probably going to break even. It is ridiculous. On £660 million, we are likely to break even. We may make a profit, depending on FX gains, depending on what we do. We could range from a £10 million loss to £20 million. Look, this projection, look, as I've just said, could result in a smaller profit or another net loss. Now, think about how insane that is for one of the biggest clubs in the world to make a loss on £660 million. Look, this is absolutely potentially catastrophic. Now, look, I will get into more of the key figures as well, but look, I'm going to get into the chat first, and then we will go into the key figures because I think we need to. Now, I'm just going to change the graphic as well for a second, so look, we can look at the graphics as well. So look, we're going to talk about look, as you can see there, look, projected income is 660 million. Our UEFA limit, look, we're not going to get penalised this year. Look, the bombshell of this really is, look, we've got estimated wages of £293 million. Amortisation is going to be about 215. The combined amortisation before agents' fees is 508. And this is why we've got to get the amortisation down. This is why Rashford is so important. This is why Greenwood becomes important. This is why Casemiro leaving, Sancho leaving, the Rashford wage as well, the Maguire wage coming down, Højlund coming down, Xerxes coming down. And look, this is how we create the headroom. This is how we create cash, not by the profit that we make. Now look, this is another interesting one. The nightmare, the transfer debt. Look, the borrowings long term is 490.1. The current is 262, and this is what we've got to pay. The combined debt of that is 752. This is one of the highest debt burdens in football. 29.2 in 9 months of interest, and this is cash. This is not debt. This is cash. This is what we've got to pay out. And from an annual perspective, this is £40 million. We've got to pay £40 million in cash. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? Now look, the next one here is, look, this summer window. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see this. Now look, what does this mean for the window? Look, United can spend, and we can spend, but we've got to do this in a smart way. Edison represents the business that is smart. So look, transfer fees, they matter, the wages matter, amortisation and agents' fees matter. So look, as you can see there, on a £100 million player on a 5-year deal is 20 of amortisation, 18 on the wages, and about 2 million in agents' fees. That's £40 million a year. That is the interest that we pay per year. That is cash. That is cash. If we didn't have the 40 million in interest, we would have over £100 million in cash. We would be able to more than cover these deals. And look, it is catastrophic. So look, we're gonna come on to more of the figures. Look, I'm gonna go through the chats now, as I've promised to do, and then I'll go through some more of the financial figures. Actual, we've had our little chat this morning. Go through some of these chats. Obviously you can hear me now. Look, Actual says, is the debt that has been put on the club from the Glazers, INEOS and loan debt? Look, as we saw this, look, this is long-term debt. This is the borrowings against the debt. This is credit card. This is the transfer debt as well. Look, we've got more transfer debt. Our total debt at the moment is about 1.2 billion. billion pounds. And look, as I've said there, we have got to pay 278 with the combination of the transfer fees and the debt that has to go out as well. SS Red says Barca Gordon will only drive the market even more mad. The mediocre players are going to go for 90 to 100 million. And look, I think you made an absolute fantastic point there. Liverpool below United. This is what should be. Your title win was a fluke. I'm going to go into some more of the chat. I spend hundreds on football kits this year. This makes enough money. So look, we are going to go into the debt figures, and these are the Q3. And look, other channels may cover this. They're not going to cover this right. United are going to try to spin you a yarn, and look, we're going to go through the key figures. Look, we are going to do the positives. Look, let's start off with the positives. Let's start off with the statement of financial position, and this is basically the profit and loss. This is operationally, and listen to this, because operationally we are elite. We are still elite. Look, we finished 15th last season. We finished 3rd this season, and operationally we are elite. Look, our revenue to date is 189.5. This is from last this is up from 160.5. That's an 18.1% increase. The revenue for 9 months is 520 from 502. This is an increase of 3.5%. Look, the boost has come from the better Champions League finish, the broadcasting money, and strong commercial. Broadcasting income is 64.9, up from 41.3, 57% increase. This is one of the biggest positives of this club. Look, we should be smashing revenue. We are absolutely a juggernaut in making money, in making cash. And look, we will probably finish, look, because of the higher finish in this league. So look, commercial revenue is 82.4. This is up by 10.3%. It slightly fell because sponsorship came down, but look, we have found a new sponsorship, and thanks to Sky, the merchandise has exploded. Look, United fans still buy shirts. Look, it suggests, because we finished 3rd this season, better fan engagement, better shirt sales, and on the pitch, the pitch results are helping drive sales, and this is why we need to finish in the Champions League. Look, the match day income is roughly down in Q3, 42.2, which is 5.2% down. But look, this is because we've played fewer home games. But look, it's only 5.2%. Look, this is not catastrophic. Look, this is not alarming, considering we played a lot less games. Now look, this is where people will look to con you. This is where INEOS and Omar will look to push this harder publicly. Adjusted EBITDA for 9 months is 187.5. So it just means commercially, before amortization, before equity, debt, amortization, tax, 9 months is 187.5. This is up from 147.3. 29% increase. Look, this is fantastic. Operational profit for 9 months compared to last year is 37.5 profit, compared to 3.2 operational loss last year. Look, this is huge. This club is saying the cost cutting is working. Whether I agree with the cost cutting, look, it is huge. But look, even after all of the profit, we're still operating at a 14.2 million loss. This is the net loss. So look, whilst United are going to spin, Sky's going to off to ride a horse. Yes, I will be back tonight as well. So look, this has improved from 29.1 last year. So look, we are better than last year, but look, we are still making a loss. Now look, we will go into the debt now in depth. Current, the borrowings, the non-current, which means this is long term, of 490.1. The current, and this means the debt that is due, that we owe, is 262.5. So combined, roughly, this is just in the borrowings and liabilities, is 752. Look, this also confirms that the revolving credit facility has increased and cash is under pressure. So what are the cash equivalents? Now listen to this: cash and cash equivalents, which means cash on the books, 60.9. Last year was 73.2. So cash is down, and I think this is one of the biggest talking points about cash for the club of this size. 60 million pounds in cash is not huge, especially when you consider transfer instalments, wages and debt repayments. Look, I know fans will argue United are profitable on paper, but look, we're still tight on real cash. Now look, what is noticeable is the wage control. It's very noticeable indeed. Look, the benefit expenses compared to the income is down from 46.6% of the revenue to 42.2%. What this means is reduction in headcounts and restructuring operationally. So redundancies are having a material effect. Now, transfer spending. Look, an unamortized squad registration value is 520.8. So this means effectively the remaining book value is still sitting is extremely high. So what this means is that when we talk about the book value of players, this is why getting rid of Højlund is important. This is why getting rid of Xerxes is important, and bringing down the book value of these players. Now look, the report will heavily push for context that the Michael Carrick appointment, Champions League qualification, youth success, the women's team is positive. And I get that. It does point to stability. It does point to growth. And it does point, to be fair, the progress under INEOS. Now look, United forecast for the financial year of 26. Now, I've seen other channels talk about 720, 740 for this year. That is not true. Our revenue, the guidance on that is between 655 and 665 million. So 665. Now look, this is commercially great. Now look, adjusted for EBITDA, look, this is 200 to 210. Champions League qualification is absolutely huge for this reason. Now look, what are the positives? The positives are this: the revenue has grown, the broadcasting has exploded, operational profit is improving, the EBITDA is strong, and we are talking about revenue, we are talking about income. The cost cutting is financially fantastic, and Champions League qualifications are huge. Now look, I've never said that we're not from a revenue perspective, and all people are going to talk about is the revenue that we make all of this money. And look, we make a lot of money, but this is where the negatives come in. For 660 million pounds, we spend 675 million pounds. So we still make a loss. The debt is still enormous. The cash reserves, the cash on the hip, the cash that we need to pay things off is still weak. The amortization is huge. And look, we would talk about the squad costs are on 660 million pounds. Our headroom of what we can spend up to is about 462. Our spending at the moment is 506, so we are over the squad cap rule at the moment, and this is why Casemiro is leaving, Sancho is important. It's not the profit from the players sold that makes the difference, it is the reduction in amortization. Look, our financial flexibility at the moment in this market, we talk about Tonali, we talk about, look, let's just say this. If Tonali is going to cost us £40 million, we're going to have to pay the first instalment on that deal. That's £40 million potentially from cash. That will leave us 20 million cash. Edison is going to cost us in and around £15 million. With £55 million in cash, look, this is catastrophic. And look, the real story here is this business, and look, the business operations are improving, but United are still carrying the consequences of years of debt and bad spending and the mismanagement of this club. And that really is the tension of the results. So look, get into the chat. You know, I want to know what you think about these results. Does it change your mind? Look, from a revenue commercial perspective and EBITDA, United will heavily push this. They will heavily push this financial rhetoric. What they won't promote is the net loss. What they won't promote is the fact that we've made a loss. What they won't promote, we're losing £40 million, £50 million. That has to go out the door in cash equivalents. The debt is crippling us, and when we talk about the debt, we are not necessarily talking about the long-term debt. We are, because of the interest that we've got to pay. The transfer debt has to be paid, and how are we going to buy these players? So look, it is the Q3 result. In one respect, it is a tale of two sides. On the one hand, look, the club is making money. The club is selling shirts. The club is a financial powerhouse of making money. But we made a 14-15 million pounds loss, which means the money going out of the door is more money than we make as a club. And we are one of the biggest financial powerhouses in the world, but we are carrying so much debt. So look, when we talk about Tonali and we're talking about Anderson, look, other channels are not going to talk about this. All they're going to talk about is the transfer fees. All they're going to talk about is we're going to make profit, which is not true. Look, they're going to focus on we're going to get £110 million in the transfer fees. No, we're not. We're going to probably make profit of about 36 million. You know, I've seen the rhetoric in this club that Højlund, we're getting £38 million for that deal. Look, we're going to make a loss on Højlund. We're going to make a £5 million loss. Where the benefit of Højlund comes into this is the amortization. The wages are going to come off. You know, the other bonuses are going to come off. That is what the real impact of the sale is. Rashford is a different story, and this is why Rashford is not going to come back. This is why Rashford has to be sold. This is why the Greenwood transfer is going to be so important. You know, look, if Onana can be sold, believe this or not, Onana could make profit for this club. But look, the real story here is United are still making a loss. We are crippled by debt payments and our cash isn't good. And as SS Red says there, imagine you've got a hose with water capable of easily filling with a massive bucket. Now imagine the bucket has many Glazer size holes, and that is exactly it. Look, we've got no problem in making cash. Look, United are elite. United were elite before INEOS. INEOS are not making this cash. INEOS are not the reason why we make this cash. We were making money with Arnold. We were making money with a Murtock. We've always been financially strong. What Sir Jim is coming in to do is cost cut. That is what his role is. But we are still making a loss. So look, when we are talking about Tonali, we do have to, Anderson, these big players, we do have to put a caution. And as I've said on this channel, I think we're going to have a cheap summer. Look, people talking about transfer fees of 300 million, I don't think is right. United pre-season tours, Finland, Norway, Sweden, then to Dublin, not big income from these countries. Exactly. And this is why revenue is projected 660 for this year. Look, hopefully, and this is why Champions League and consistency is more important. If we get deeper into the Champions League, our revenue next year will probably be in and around 720 million pounds. So this is why consistency is so important for next year. So look, it's just a bit of a show on the Q3 results. I know people are not necessarily going to be interested in it, but what I wanted to do, I wanted this to put on camera. So when other channels are talking, and they'll talk about profit is up, so we should be able to spend 300 to 400 million pounds. It's crap. They're talking absolutely crap because they don't know the numbers, and I'm not going to name names, but the channels will talk about the headline figures. They're not going to talk about the loss. They're not going to talk about the catastrophic debt that we have. So look, it's just a quick show, well, an hour show on the debt, the Q3 results. And look, I will be back this evening. Look, thank you for watching, those of you who have put in your chats on the subject. Legends, absolute legends of this channel. Look, and thank you so much for listening to this. So look, this is up there if anybody wants to watch after. Look, the results are all up there, and hopefully I've explained this in a manner that makes sense. So look, when other channels are talking about this, go on to them and tell them, look, you're talking absolute nonsense, because the debt is going to hamper the things that we do this summer. So look, on that note, look, thank you guys for watching. You are legends of this channel. I really appreciate your views. I will be back this evening. I'm JB. This is the United Devil channel, and I'll see you guys later on. Take care.